It was a frozen Tuesday morning in February when a woman in a caramel wool coat slid a contract across a folding table with a smirk she didn't bother hiding. $1,000, that was the number she attached to a crumbling garage she openly called not worth the cost of clearing, and when the man standing across from her, grease permanently etched beneath his fingernails, scuffed work jacket, said nothing and simply took the key and walked away into the gray winter air, she turned to her team and said something that made them all laugh, and 6 months later she stood outside a building that used to belong to her company, staring at a reality she had manufactured herself and could not undo. His name was Caleb Merritt, and before you dismiss this as a lucky story, understand exactly who this man was. His father Raymond opened a one-bay garage on the edge of Detroit in 1987 and ran it for 22 years until his back gave out, and Caleb spent every Saturday of his childhood not in front of a television but inside that shop, learning to listen to an engine the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat, learning to read stress fractures in steel the way an engineer reads a blueprint, learning to see past rust and cracked paint and dead batteries to the mechanical soul underneath, and by 17 he could diagnose engine faults by sound alone. By 19 he rebuilt transmissions from scratch. By 22 he had an engineering degree in automotive systems and a position at Vantage Auto Holdings, one of the region's most respected restoration firms, where he spent 7 years being the person everyone called when a job seemed impossible to save. And then one Friday night at 11:17 p.m., he got an email. The company had been acquired, the restoration division didn't fit the new financial model, 14 people lost their jobs notified by email late at night like a footnote, and Caleb read his on his phone at his kitchen table in a rented apartment that barely held his tools and a bed. He did not reply, he closed the screen, sat in the dark for a long time, and the next morning he started making a list, because he was 31 years old. With $18,000 in savings and something no corporate merger could take, the ability to look at something broken and see what it could become. Now the other side of this story, Giselle Harmon had never fixed anything with her hands in her life and would have told you that with no apology. She was 38, sharp, relentless, the kind of intelligent that builds things fast and cuts losses faster, inherited her father's real estate firm at 29 and more than doubled its revenue in a decade. A visionary according to her Chamber of Commerce and a bulldozer according to everyone who negotiated against her, and in January of that year Harmon Capital acquired 4 acres of dormant industrial land on the northeastern edge of the city with a clean plan, rezone, flip, profit, but the property came with a complication sitting in the back corner, a 900-square-foot garage built in the 1960s with a dead electrical system, 3 collapsed shelving units, a sagging roof, and a roll-up door that hadn't opened in 3 years. Her team quoted $12,000 to $15,000 to demolish it, and Giselle had a faster idea: sell it, make it someone else's burden. Owen Parker heard about the garage from a truck driver who hauled scrap in the area, called Caleb the same evening more out of instinct than certainty. Old garage, bad condition, Harmon Capital wants it gone, might sell cheap, and Caleb said very little on the phone, drove out to the property the next morning before sunrise, parked across the street in 20-degree wind cut cold, sat in his car for 15 minutes without moving, and from the outside the building was objectively unimpressive. But Caleb was not looking at what was visible, he was calculating dimensions, noting the foundation, reading the address, because he knew this intersection, had driven through it dozens of times, knew what was nearby and what was adjacent, and had a quiet precise suspicion about what was coming to this part of the city within the next 12 to 18 months. Giselle arrived the following week with 3 people, her assistant, a structural engineer, and a real estate attorney, wearing heeled boots and the expression of someone who had already decided the meeting was a formality, and when she stepped out of her car she looked at Caleb for about 3 seconds and made a complete assessment, asked whether he was a mechanic or a scrap hauler. He didn't answer, asked to see the inside, and inside she narrated the defects like a reverse real estate agent: the jammed roll-up, the cracked ceiling joists, the dead electrical, possible foundation settling in the northwest corner, her team's assessment at $15,000, making it clear this was not a bargain but a problem with a price tag, and Caleb walked the interior for 12 minutes with a phone flashlight, wall to wall, corner to corner, crouching down, pressing his hand against the concrete, then came back out into the cold and asked one question: how much? And Giselle Repeated it to her team like a punchline, $1,000 with a liability waiver and an 18-month relocation clause, and Caleb agreed on the spot, no counter, no hesitation, signed at the folding table in the wind with the key in his jacket pocket before her group had finished laughing. And as she walked to her car she told her assistant loud enough to be heard that she was noting in the file the sale of a derelict garage to a very optimistic man. He came back the next morning at 6 a.m. with a heavy flashlight, pry bar, hand tools, and a spiral notebook, and he did not start with the structure, he started with the tarps, 8 of them in varying sizes, layered and tied with rope, coated in years of dust and the silence of a sealed forgotten building. And he pulled the first one back slowly the way you open something you're fairly sure is valuable but cannot afford to be wrong about. And underneath was a car. He pulled the second tarp. And there was another car. He worked through all 8 in under 30 minutes, 8 automobiles arranged in 2 rough rows, every single one covered and left, in a building that Giselle Harmon's professional team had walked into, looked around, and classified as an empty demolition target without once lifting a single tarp. And he stood in the center of those 8 cars with his flashlight moving slowly from hood to hood and said absolutely nothing. The first car he cleared enough dust to read, a 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback, surface rust, peeling paint, but chrome trim fully present, glass intact, original VIN stampings confirmed, engine block present with no catastrophic damage. He wrote 4 numbers in his notebook and closed the hood gently. The second car elevated his pulse. A 1969 Chevrolet Camaro Z28, one of the most coveted production variants in American muscle car history, frame number readable, rally sport trim intact. He circled the notation. Cars 3 through 5, a 1958 Chevrolet Bel Air, a 1961 Ford Galaxy, a 1963 Buick Riviera, all recoverable, all valuable. But car number 6 stopped him completely. He had to crouch down and read the badge from a specific angle to be certain he was seeing it correctly. A 1971 De Tomaso Pantera, an Italian-American sports car produced in limited numbers through a partnership between a legendary Italian coach builder and Ford's engine division. Total global production across all years approximately 10,000 units. And finding one sealed in a forgotten northeast garage with its chassis intact was the kind of thing that happens in stories, except this was not yet a story. It was still just a cold building, a flashlight beam, and a man's hand that was not entirely steady as it wrote the number down, his rough estimate sitting on an overturned milk crate, between $400,000 and $600,000 in restored market value. Against the $1,000 he had paid for the building and everything inside it. But the cars were only half of what Caleb had seen. That afternoon he walked the surrounding blocks and the garage sat at a corner lot a quarter mile from a federal highway on-ramp, directly adjacent to a bus corridor the city had been quietly planning to expand for 18 months. 3 vacant lots sat immediately behind the garage listed at prices that reflected how they looked, abandoned, unlandscaped, chain-linked. Nobody had connected those lots to the infrastructure map yet, and Caleb called an acquaintance from his engineering years named Marcus who now worked in municipal planning and asked one neutral question about development zone classifications for that quadrant, and Marcus gave him one neutral answer. The entire block sat inside the city's Phase 2 commercial development priority zone, meaning within 12 to 18 months land values across the zone would shift dramatically, and Caleb thanked him, hung up, sat at his kitchen table, looked at the numbers in his notebook, and smiled. It was the first time he had smiled without reservation since the night he read his layoff email. He called Owen the next morning, told him only that he'd found something. There was no salary in the immediate term, and he believed it would be worth the investment of time, and when Owen asked how much Caleb had paid for the property and Caleb said $1,000 there was a pause. Owen asked him to repeat the number. He did, another pause, then Owen said he'd be there by 8. And when Owen walked into the garage and saw 8 classic cars partially uncovered he stood completely still, looked at the Camaro, then the Mustang, then the Pantera, turned to Caleb and said quietly that he needed to sit down, and Caleb said they would start with the Mustang and Owen took off his jacket and asked where the tools were. The first 2 months were relentless, repetitive, cold, and occasionally demoralizing. Caleb slept in the garage for the first 3 weeks to save rent, a cot near the south wall where the wind didn't cut through. They worked from before sunrise to well past dark. Parts had to be sourced from private suppliers in Ohio, money moved in one direction, out, and by the end of the first month Caleb had $1,200 left. Didn't tell Owen, took 2 nights of towing work to generate enough cash for the next batch of supplies and said nothing about it, and one night when a section of the roof failed in a rainstorm and water poured into the open engine bay of the Camaro they had completely disassembled, Owen put his fist on the workbench and said things not worth repeating, and Caleb stood looking at the water pooling in the cylinder cavities, found 2 additional tarps, covered everything that was exposed, cleaned up the water with rags, went back to what he had been doing, and Owen watched him for a minute and then picked up his tools and went back to work too. There was one night in late February when Caleb sat alone in the garage and took out a different notebook, not the spiral one with the vehicle records but an older one, water-stained at the corner, that had belonged to his father. Raymond Merritt had filled it over 30 years of working on cars, observations, measurements, small pieces of philosophy accumulated the way grease accumulates in the threads of an old bolt. And on one page near the middle in his father's blunt handwriting was the sentence, "When they see rust, you see the metal underneath." Caleb had read those words perhaps 100 times in his life, and as a child they had sounded like a mechanic's proverb, but as an adult who had spent 7 years in a corporate firm and been laid off by email they sounded like the most economically accurate thing anyone had ever written down. He took out a pen, wrote below his father's words, $1,000. February, this is where it starts. Closed the notebook, put it in the inner pocket of his jacket, and it stayed there for the rest of the project. By the end of March the Mustang was finished, not modified, not glamorized, but restored correctly and completely to its original factory specification, body stripped and resprayed in factory-correct Highland green, chrome re-chromed where necessary, engine rebuilt with period-correct components, interior ret-rimmed in correct black vinyl. And on a Saturday morning Owen rolled it out of the garage, sat behind the wheel, turned the key, the engine caught on the second crank and settled into an idle that was deep and even and entirely authoritative. Caleb stood at the edge of the open roll-up with his arms folded and listened for a full minute. Owen revved it once gently and the exhaust note moved through the cold morning air in a way that couldn't be expressed in numbers, and Caleb said only, "It's good," and went back inside. He posted a single listing on a private collector forum, no auction platform, no open marketplace, just a carefully worded description, documented vehicle history, photographs of the restoration work, and a contact number. Received 11 inquiries in 72 hours, and the one he prioritized came from Diana Ashford, 55 years old, who had spent a decade building one of the most serious private collections of American classics in the Northeast, and she arrived with her own mechanical engineer, a retired Chrysler man named George who spent 2 hours underneath the car with a borescope, and George told Diana in a low voice that the restoration was about as correct as anything he had seen outside a museum, and Diana shook Caleb's hand and offered $94,000. Caleb accepted. The wire transfer cleared 3 days later. Owen grabbed him by the shoulder and Caleb allowed it for about 2 seconds, then stepped back, nodded once, and walked to the workbench to pick up where he had left off on the Camaro. Within weeks Diana had passed Caleb's contact to 2 collectors in her network and he sold the 1958 Bel Air, restored in factory-correct snow crest white over India ivory two-tone, for $28,500, and between those 2 sales he had cleared $122,000 in revenue against a total outlay of $19,000, moved on the land immediately, purchased the 2 vacant lots behind the garage through private transaction for $67,000 combined from owners who had no knowledge of the Phase 2 zoning designation, filed the deeds, began business registration, hired 2 additional technicians, Kevin, a body specialist from Pennsylvania, and Ray, a part sourcing expert with 15 years tracking rare components, and registered the business under the name Merritt Restoration and Auto Works. The De Tomaso Pantera consumed 6 weeks and tested every skill the team collectively possessed. The seized Ford Cleveland V8 required a chemical freeing process that took 11 days and an amount of patience Owen described as almost religious. Sourcing correct body panels meant importing fabrications from a specialist outside Bologna who communicated primarily by fax machine. The interior required correct specification vinyl from Germany and carpet from New Jersey. The wheels were rebuilt from the center out. The Italian electrical system was in Owen's professional opinion a deliberate challenge engineered to ensure future mechanics would never rest easy, but when it was finished, standing under full garage lighting with its deep red paint restored to a depth that seemed to absorb light rather than merely reflect it, its aggressive Italian-American wedge profile as controlled and purposeful as the day it left the factory in 1971, it was without question the finest single object any of them had ever had a hand in producing. Charlotte Webb had been covering business and finance for 9 years with a specific instinct for finding stories the financial press hadn't yet classified as stories, and when she reached out, Caleb told her politely he wasn't interested in being interviewed, so she sent him an email the following day, not offering a favorable profile or promising positive coverage, but writing that she wasn't interested in documenting success. She was interested in the moment someone saw something everyone else had dismissed and chose to act on what they saw. Caleb read it twice, thought about it for a day, agreed to 30 minutes, they met in the garage and talked for 2.5 hours, and when she asked who had sold him the property, Caleb said without heat or emphasis that the property had been sold by Harmon Capital Group and that the CEO had signed the paperwork personally, and Charlotte wrote this down and underlined it. The Barrett-Jackson special consignment event was held the last Saturday of June. Caleb arrived in a dark suit, the first time he'd worn one since his father's funeral 5 years earlier. Owen sat in the second row, arms crossed, jaw set, trying not to show he was nervous. Diana Ashford was in the audience, and when the Pantera came through the curtain onto the main floor there was an audible shift in the room. Not applause yet, just the collective intake of breath that happens when something genuinely beautiful enters a space. The bidding opened at $80,000, moved to $100, then $130, paused at $155 before a phone bidder pushed it to $168. A man in the third row came back at $172. The room went completely quiet, and the hammer came down at $178,000. Owen exhaled so loudly that the man next to him turned around, and Caleb sat completely still for a moment. After the gavel fell, then stood, accepted the handshake, composed the way only people who have spent months working in a cold garage toward a specific outcome can be composed, not surprised, not overwhelmed, just confirmed. Giselle Harmon was at the event. Her attorney had advised her to understand the full scope of what had happened before deciding how to respond to the article, and after the room thinned she crossed the hall toward Caleb, a walk that required something from her, not remorse exactly because Giselle Harmon was not built for remorse, but something adjacent to it. Something that required overriding the self-protective narrative she had been running since the morning the article landed on her desk. And she stopped in front of him without her team, no assistant, no attorney, no engineer, and said that she had misjudged the situation. She did not elaborate, did not reach for additional language, and from a woman who had built her professional identity on the premise that her assessments were more accurate than everyone else's, those 6 words were in their way complete. And Caleb looked at her for a moment and did not revisit February, did not quote her words back to her, did not perform the vindication that the moment technically offered him, said in a level voice that she had seen what the building looked like and made a call based on what was visible and that he had made a different call based on what he believed was underneath, said they had looked at the same thing with different equipment, then extended his hand. She shook it, he turned and walked back to Owen, and they started talking about the Camaro. By the end of June the full picture of Merit Restoration and AutoWorks looked like this: total vehicle sale revenue of $398,000, the 3 land parcels, following the formal public announcement of the Phase 2 infrastructure program in May, independently assessed at a combined value of $520,000, approximately 3 times what Caleb had paid. Active restoration contracts totaling $145,000 in confirmed work, and total net asset value of the operation estimated to exceed $1 million. Owen Parker was offered a formal 20% equity position which he accepted without a long conversation, and Caleb submitted a building permit application for a permanent multi-bay facility on the consolidated lot, named on the application documents, Merit AutoWorks, Building 1. He went back to the garage alone on a Thursday evening in early July after the crew had gone home, not to work but just to stand in it, the roof replaced in April, the floor cleaned and sealed, the roll-up door on a new motor, the electrical entirely new, the space organized and lit and for the first time since its construction genuinely alive, and he walked to the eastern corner, the one where he had pressed his hand against the wall on that first morning with the tarps and the flashlight and the notebook, The wall he had told Kevin during the renovation to leave exactly as it was because it was the most important part of the building, original concrete block spotted with rust stains, darkened with age, exactly as it had been when he first touched it, and he stood in front of it for a while, then turned off the bay lights, locked the roll-up door, and walked to his truck. People who heard this story often asked Caleb what the lesson was, and he gave different answers depending on who was asking. To tradespeople he said credentials don't protect you and neither does institutional loyalty, so build the thing you can build with your own hands. To younger people he said being dismissed is not the same as being wrong, and the shortest answer he ever gave, the one that appeared in print most often, was simply, look more carefully before you decide, but in private, in the notebook that lived in his jacket pocket, he wrote something longer below his father's words and below his own entry from February, that Giselle had seen the cost of things and called it value, and that he had tried to see the value of things and let the cost figure itself out, that she had looked at rust and seen a problem, and that he had looked at rust and tried to understand what the metal underneath was capable of, that neither of them had been irrational, they had simply been trained to look for different things. And in that one transaction on that one cold morning the difference between those two ways of seeing had been worth approximately $1,000 on one side of the ledger, and everything else on the other.